Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pam Schaff. I'm the director of the HEAL program and of the Narrative Medicine program. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. D.T. Max, or Daniel, grew up in New York City and graduated from Harvard University. He spent a year at the University of Salamanca in Florence, where he studied Spanish and Italian. And he worked for many years as a book editor and then started writing nonfiction. Since 2010, he's been a staff writer at The New Yorker, and in 2006, he published The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a medical mystery, a book that is at once a piece of science journalism and a point of entry to explore what it means to be sick in a well world. The New York Times Book Review praised it as gripping, cleanly written, cannily plotted, and elegantly educational. Daniel is also the author of Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, and Finale, Late Conversations with Stephen Sondheim, a series of interviews with the legendary Broadway lyricist and composer. He is the recipient of Guggenheim and Leon Levy Fellowships and was Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Daniel is visiting today from Montclair, New Jersey, where he lives with his wife and their 2 kids, one of whom is a senior at USC. It's now my pleasure to welcome him today to speak with us about his book, about The Family That Couldn't Sleep, an Italian family's journey through the centuries with an inherited prion disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here partially because my son is actually a senior at USC, so that's the second reason I'm out here. But we're going to do, I think, are all of you guys med school students? Everybody? Half of you? Hands? Anyone? And everyone else is sort of doing research in biology? I just want to know how technical to get. Okay. Well, so you're going to get a non-specialist tour of a very strange disease. And we're going to start with, this all comes out of a book that I wrote called The Family That Couldn't Sleep. And it's about an Italian family who for 200 years have had a fatal insomnia that passed. It was a dominant mutation, we know now, and passed through the generations and did enormous harm. So the book is partially about the medicine and partially about the kind of culture of a family that has the kind of disease that just dogs them from generation to generation. But we're going to start with the one bit of science you do have to digest as a non-specialist in reading the book. And I won't make you all break off from your burritos to get a show of hands for how many people know what a prion is, but I'm guessing maybe some of you do. So a prion is a protein, like any other protein. It's in all your cells, and it has the unusual skill that when it malforms, it causes adjacent prions to malform. What that does, what makes it interesting, is it can effectively cause an infection, even though it's not an infectious material. And so it's the great footnote to the basic idea of Koch's postulates about what can and can't cause an infection, because it's non-living, it has no RNA and no DNA, obviously, as a protein. Okay, so how do we know this? We know this only now, but we've had diseases of prions for all of recorded history. This is a sheep, yes, you know that, and it's rubbed itself raw. And sheep that rub themselves raw suffer from a disease called scrapie, which, if you think of it sort of as if a Scottish person pronounced it, scrapie, you understand that as like the sheep is scraping himself. So it's not actually a very technical term, but no one knew why. And there were different theories about why, involving what they ate, whether they were being bred or not, and so on. But basically nobody could figure out what was going on. And it's just one of those things. Now, people actually preferred to eat scrapie sheep because scrapie sheep lose weight, and it makes for particularly delicious mutton pie. But there were no observable or known effects from all those mutton pies that were eaten over the centuries. 1950s Papua New Guinea. strange disease. No one knows any connection to scrapie, obviously. This is a disease called Kuru, also known as the laughing disease. Although, honestly, I think the symptoms rarely involved laughter and more likely involved uncontrolled shaking. But anyway, the national newspapers and so on that went to see these poor victims thought they were laughing, and so it became known as the laughing disease in the 1950s. So what are the symptoms? Well, not entirely unlike scrapie, but also not that similar. It's some sort of uncontrolled shaking, a failure to regulate body temperature, and it strikes only women and children in Papua New Guinea in the 1950s, which then was still an Australian protectorate. Third unconnected disease, mad cow disease. Now we're getting a little closer to the present. This is the 1980s in England. So mad cow disease, if you were around then, kind of dominated the headlines. And what it was these normally docile cows were attacking their milkers, but they also had the inability to stand up. They were stumbling, they were erratic, and no one knew what was happening, except that it seemed, unlike scrapie, that if you ate mad cow, if you ate meat that was infected with mad cow, you would unfortunately get a disease which was fatal. And about 190 people consumed, we know now, consumed this infected meat or meat with this prion infection and died. Two questions you'd want to ask yourself, I think, if you're an epidemiologist. One is why anyone died, and I think the other thing you'd want to ask yourself is why so few people died. Because when mad cow was in the food chain in England, billions and billions of doses of mad cow infected burger were churned out and eaten. So what did we know about the earlier disease, Kuru? Well, a very, very famous sorry, I got my slides slightly in the wrong order. Don't look. Oh, did I lose that? Oh, here he is. Okay, he's in the wrong place. So this guy, Carlton Gajdusek, Nobel winner in 1976. And if any of you there are hoping to win a Nobel Prize, the good news is you don't actually have to be right to win one. So Carlton Gajdusek found out or figured out through a very, very extensive work of epidemiology in Papua New Guinea that he tried every possible reason for why these young people and women and the parent and the mothers were dying and couldn't figure it out, right? But he came up with a number of great ideas. And one idea was that there was a slow virus, so slow it wasn't in the literature, and that this slow virus was killing them. Okay, so Carlton, unfortunately, and I knew Carlton, had the power of his convictions, but he didn't actually do a very good job of looking with his eyes. And it took a couple of anthropologists to realize that what was happening was that why women, why children? That was the question they asked themselves, because they weren't really exposed to anything different from the men, except in the sort of religious tradition of this tribe, the foray, the women and children consumed parts of the deceased at the mortuary feast. Okay, so they're eating other humans. Well, why is that interesting? Because a disease involving prion passes much more quickly from like to like. So let's go back to our cows, right? Because the cows are being investigated around the same time, and we'll get to our family in a second. So what are the cows doing different in the 1980s that they'd never done before? Why are cows suddenly getting mad cow disease in England, whereas, there had been cows in England, well, since there were cows? Well, they had changed the feed, and they had started giving cattle in England rendered cow parts from other cows. So you see, now we have a pattern. What's happening here is they're again being fed a similar protein, and somehow this protein is causing a disease. That's all we really know at this point. We don't know why it would cause a disease. We don't know what a prion is. We just have a couple of epidemiological facts. Okay, so enter my Italian family. The man that's standing was an ordinary doctor of medicine in Italy. He was actually the head of internal medicine at a hospital. He was a significant doctor, but he was a retail doctor. He wasn't a researcher. He never had his name on any papers. He marries the woman seated, and he discovers, he knows before they marry, that her family has a long-term inherited disease. And in this disease, members of the family, about half of them, die in their 50s. And they die, from diverse causes if you're not a doctor. Like insomnia is a cause for some of them, but for some of them they stop eating. For some of them they have spiking fevers. For others of them, and in the family's tradition, remember this is before there were doctors telling them what to think about what was happening, they thought that it was brought on by shock. So for instance, there'd be a woman whose lover broke up with her and suddenly she got the disease. There was a man who we'll see in a minute, who was involved in a bank heist in Venice, which is sort of a weird idea if you think about it. How do you get away? Do you have your motorboat waiting by the pier? But this guy, Ignacio, the doctor, starts asking, and he starts asking questions that are really better questions than people have ever asked before, because he's in the family, but he's not really he's not genetically in the family. So this is a picture of a grandfather who's seated. The wife is to the side, this is a little boy named Silvano, and then there are 4 daughters. These 2 will die of fatal familial insomnia. He will, and so will the little boy. But this is the 1940s, and nobody really still knows what's going on, except that they all fear that when they get to be a certain age, they'll begin to get these symptoms. And the first symptom they get is that their eyes become little tiny pinpricks. They don't know why that's the first symptom. We know why it's the first symptom now, but they don't know why. And there's never really been any modern pathology. There's never been any modern anatomy done on this family. I mean, they're essentially suffering privately and endlessly. So what happens is that one of those 2 young women, when she's in her 50s, enters the hospital, and modern medicine begins to sort of look. So this is Italian, but what it says here, this is her chart. It says temperatura non miserabile perché il mercurio, and then it says basically the point is that her fever is so high that it exceeds the glass for the thermometer. They have no idea what this can possibly be. I mean, there's nothing in their literature that explains a fever that intense. And there's she's molto agitata. She's very agitated. Anyway, it gives the clinical notes, ending with her death. Meanwhile, Ignacio, the doctor who enters the family, has begun his own kind of genealogical research with the help of his wife, who is genetically part of the family. So in Italy, older genealogy records are not held by the state. They're held in the Catholic churches in the different towns. Ignacio was Catholic, and he was also an organist. And so what he would do is he would go into the churches, or really into the parish house, greet the father, and he would say to the father, I hear you have an absolutely superb organ in your church. I would love to play it. And the father would say, certo, avanti, and then he'd go and he'd play a few bars, but he knew that being a priest in Italy in these small towns was not the most exciting thing in the world, and the guy would almost certainly be watching TV within minutes. So he'd stop playing the organ and then sneak down into the parish records area, where he puts together this extraordinary genealogy of the family. Some of this has been superseded, but not most of it. So anyone with the little black mark obviously had the gene and died from it. And I think the penetration is essentially 100%. So like if you have it, you will get the disease. He also looks at the old parish records, and this is the beautiful handwriting that priests had in that era, and they would enter the births and deaths by hand. So this is the arrival, I believe this is the birth of one of the members of the family. But the point is, he'd have to go through hundreds and hundreds of pages. There was no digitization of this. There was no way to Google it. He just sat there, looking at these documents. He had terrific focus. Yeah, this is the birth of Vincenzo. You can see that. So I enter the scene, okay? No story is complete without the journalist who's there to tell it. And I'm friendly with Ignacio and his family, and he and I start doing some of the work together, taking his genealogy and just going and doing some of the additional research. So here, you'll see this was my chart as we tried to figure out the causes of people's deaths. And this is a very, very good genealogy of the family. And whenever somebody died of the disease. I'm a terrible drawer, but one way or the other, they got a little picture of Edvard Munch's The Scream, or my best rendition of it. So that's not something you would show a patient, but it was what I did to keep track. So what do we find out over time? Well, what we find out is that there's this strange familial disease, and that it's laying waste generation after generation, that there's really nothing comparable in the world. It's not like you could type in these symptoms, and there were basic search engines at the time, but you couldn't type in these symptoms and find any sort of match. And you'd never find a doctor or researcher who'd ever seen one because it was so rare. Until this fellow. Now, if you remember the little boy in the sailor outfit from the earlier slide, Silvano is now an adult, and he knows instantly when he's in his 50s, if you look at his eyes, you see the eyes are the giveaway. He knows instantly that what he has, and he goes to a very enterprising neurologist in Bologna, and they give him the usual sort of, oh, you'll get better, my friend, I'm sure it's just a fever. And he said, no, this is not a fever. This is what my family suffers from. And he said, when I'm dead, I want you to take the brain and look at it quickly. And they're like, oh, come on, you'll be fine. He's like, no, I mean it. And so that's what happened. He dies. This is a late slide from the clinic where he's, hasn't been sleeping for weeks. And one of the strange parts about it, which comes from the brain anatomy, is that you maintain your sort of higher cortical function. I mean, you basically know where you are and what's happening to you, because the disease attacks the thalamus, and what actually happens is that the prions basically dig a hole in the thalamus. So although it is an insomnia, it's also a disease of body temperature regulation, a disease of hormone regulation. I didn't name it fatal familial insomnia. I mean, I think that's almost like, it's just something that the doctors understood to be central to it, but they did say to me that they knew when they found that name that they had a disease people would remember. I mean, because they also could have called it, prion-related thalamic degeneration, but then we would not be here. So he passes away. His brain goes to, this is him towards the end. You can actually also see his eyes. I mean, I don't know, maybe he's just looking into the sun, but at least I've always thought that there's something also strange about the way he's holding his body. This is shortly before he becomes clinically ill. All right, his body goes to a very, very capable neurologist named Elio Lugorese. And Lugorese sort of throws everything he has at trying to understand what's going on with the disease. And he in turn sends samples to an Italian pathologist. This is an entirely Italian story in Cleveland, at Case Western. And the pathologist is the one who finds those little holes in the thalamus. So what we now know is that we have an incredible disruption of the sleep cycle and holes in the thalamus. We know that it goes off the charts, and we know also that the hormone system is constantly firing. All right, so this is all just a curiosity, really, until this guy comes along. So, second Nobel Prize in prion disease, Stanley Prusiner, 2002. Prusiner takes some of the disease tissue from the family, as well as from people who have a sporadic version of this disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease that's been around forever, but has no genetic, and it has no genetic and no infectious ramifications. Remember, what we have here is something really interesting. We have a disease that is genetic, as in the family. It is sporadic, as in this Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which doctors see. It's like 1 in a million. But experienced referring hospitals, generally will see a case every few years. It's not unknown. And then 3, we have the case of these animals and of Kuru, which is we have it as an infection. Well, that's not, that should not be possible. I mean, there are some cancers that sort of fit this, or cancer as a group sort of fits this definition, but we don't have any other disease, I believe still, that covers all 3 bases. So what Prusiner does is so Guy de Scheck belongs, the previous Nobel Prize winner, belongs to the sort of Indiana Jones period of epidemiological research on fatal familial insomnia. In other words, he's out there, living in Papua New Guinea, having the time of his life, taking blood from everything that he can catch. Prusen's the opposite. Prusen's a real bench scientist. And what he's trying to figure out is it really possible that there could be a protein that causes an infection? So the only way to do that is to purify the tissue endlessly until you can prove that there's nothing big enough to be a virus or even any sort of nucleic acids. Therefore, it would have to be a protein, right? And so he does this and does this and does this, and he wins the Nobel Prize, proving that there is a way to cause disease without the presence of a virus, a bacteria, or any other of the standard disease-causing agents. Okay, so that puts him in a great position. He's got his Nobel Prize. What about the family, right? I mean, this is in a way supposed to be a lecture most of all about the culture of disease. Well, fatal familial insomnia becomes famous. This is a book published only in Canada, but I just like the slide because it's actually at the height of mad cow fear in America, which is around 2000, 2001. They would occasionally find a cow with mad cow disease in the food chain, and it would be a sporadic case. It wouldn't be because of the feed, because weirdly in the US, we didn't feed cows rendered cattle parts. But there are still sporadic cases. So, and then everybody would sort of panic and urge the USDA to put a new oversight on meat. Interestingly, as far as we know, I mean, people in America never did get sick, and people in England stopped getting sick after they changed the feed. But this was a story about somebody who used an inoculum of prions to cause some sort of epidemic in Canada. Not very likely, but an interesting idea. This is Ignacio years later, and what he is now in charge of, besides his day job, is a foundation that is raising money in Italy for the family. Now, I'm not currently in touch with them, but I would be surprised if they aren't actually doing embryo selection at this point, which would be a much easier way to get rid of the disease. It's a very, very simple mutation to sort for, and it could be gone in a generation. There may be members of the family who won't do that. I mean, it is also quite a Catholic family. All right, America. We're in America. The woman on my right, and also your right, has the fatal familial gene. She and her husband, I discovered them because they wrote me a letter after the book came out, but she and her husband did something very different than the Italians. They were both people who had master's degrees, but not in medicine. They quit their jobs and they became full-time prion researchers. This is absolutely an extraordinary decision to make. They do have children, and they did use embryo selection, so they know that she's the only one who could be affected by it. But they're essentially in a race against time to try and find some sort of either a cure or a palliative or some sort of genetic editing that could be used in order to prevent her from suffering from the disease that her mother died from, and I think also it was her grandfather. In America, when you start a cause, you get a T-shirt with your insignia on it. In Italy, they publish beautiful little pamphlets. And so this is the pamphlet of the Italian Association for Fatal Familial Insomnia. You can see it's a symbol of Hypnos, who's the god of sleep. They remain in a very difficult situation from a research point of view, because I remember I was speaking to Ignacio once, and the doctor, and I said, why do you think Italian medicine is so far behind US medicine? He's a very good doctor. And he said it's because of the NIH. He said, in Italy, we don't have an NIH. We have no central funding. The money all comes from separate sources. And you can never get enough of it to do something like proteinomics or protein research. So that takes us to the end of the story. I thought there was one more slide, but I wanted to show you vacuoles. But I think my vacuole slide, which is what a thalamus of a brain looks like stained after fatal familial insomnia, you see all these white spaces in between the cells that are still alive. But I know that slide didn't make it in. So anyway, that's the story. I would be eager to take questions, and I'm even willing to take a potted question from Pam if she wants to start it off, because I know that everyone else is digesting their steak burritos probably needs a cup of coffee. So you're on the spot.
Well, I guess my first question, I'm just curious about why this story? Like, how were you attracted to this? And obviously, you spent a whole bunch of time, and it does seem like a mystery worth pursuing and solving. But how did it capture your attention and your time?
So, I would just go back to the early slide where you see me with my. So, I'm not medically trained. In my family, whenever anyone has a cold or a fever or whatever, my wife always turns to me and says, "Well, you're an expert on prion diseases, so you really know that." But I am interested in medicine, and I'm interested in mysteries. I found the story in a way that's almost always a disappointment. I found the story because my editor, I was then at the New York Times Magazine, said that we were doing an issue on diseases that crossed international borders. And I first wanted to go on the Hajj, but it was because the Hajj has terrible epidemiological problems, the pilgrimage. And back then it would have been possible for me to go, but it was just too risky from a disease point of view. So I typed into Alta Vista, which was the predecessor of Google. There really was such a time. And it basically worked. I mean, not as well as Google, but it worked okay. And I typed in, I believe, worst disease in the world, or something very not sophisticated like that, or most disease you most don't want to get, or something. And anyway, out popped the paper on fatal familial insomnia that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And of course, I was interested. I was essentially I was basically a literature major. And so what I was interested by, of course, immediately was what you might call the sort of depressing poetics of a disease that causes this kind of insomnia, but doesn't actually take away your understanding. That struck me as the kind of cruelest part of it, was that it wasn't enough that it did these destructive things, but it let you know what was going on, at least much more than most diseases do. I mean, I don't think that Silvano in that picture, I don't think he knows what day it is, but I mean, he knows what's happening to him. And he certainly, I remember he actually kept a calendar on the wall so he could check off the dates as they went by. So I called an expert in Chicago who saw some cases. So remember, there's 3 ways this disease can get into you. One is genetic, like the family. The second one is infectious, like the victims of Kuru in Papua New Guinea. And the third one is sporadic. So he actually, weirdly enough, saw a few cases of sporadic familial insomnia. Sporadic fatal insomnia. And he was ready to talk to me about them, and I was sort of all ready to get my plane ticket to Chicago. And he said, wait. He said, there's something I think you're going to be more interested in. He said, there's a family that's had an inherited form of this condition for 200 years. And I said, oh, well, where's the family? And he said, Venice. And so, I briefly had to weigh whether I'd rather spend the next year in Chicago or Venice, and I quickly got my passport. But what had also happened was I myself had a neuromuscular disease that I write about at the end of the book. One of my tenets in the book is, it's not about me, it's about them. But if you can get through the book, which is really, not that hard, but it has a little bit of science in it that would probably not phase this group at all, but an ordinary group in a bookstore would be like, I don't know if we want to do science. If you get through that and you get all the way to the end, you get something which has the innocuous name of a note about the author. Now, a note about the author usually is, D.T. Max lives in Montclair with his wife, 2 children, and his Dachshund Springer mix. I noticed you didn't mention my dog, by the way. Is that just like policy here? We don't do the dogs? The dogs are sweet. They humanize people. They make you relatable. And he's so cute. Anyway, so what happened is, like, I just thought, I'm going to trick you. I like games. If you get this far, you get a really juicy bit of memoir. Because, people love memoir. Everyone really wishes, I think almost everything they read was memoir, and we tend to make things that aren't memoir. So it's a memoir about my diagnosis back in the 80s. And I don't know if any of you are neurologists or training to be neurologists, but it's also sort of a poison pen letter at neurologists for the sort of cruelty with which they, or not the cruelty, the lack of interest with which they treat their patients. But I've been forgiven at Columbia Presbyterian, as you know, and they invite me there, even though if they looked at it, they'd be like, oh. So I think that, I was only about 35 when I came on this story, but a little older, almost 40. But what happened is, I just think when you have a condition like that, you age differently than other people, and your interests change differently than other people's do. I don't know if I had not had that condition that I would have really been drawn to a family. I mean, the story was on one level really, really depressing and sad, and I wasn't really in a depressing or sad time of life. I had two small children. I was sort of at a different time of life. But I really feel that because of my own neurological condition, sort of the kind of clock was just different for me. And when I went and saw them, I mean, they were welcoming, I think. I think there was a time when they thought that we would save them. I mean, the original idea was that I would do the book and they would go on Oprah. Honestly, that was the idea. And for a number of reasons, that didn't quite happen. But when I came, I think they really regarded me, I mean, I don't know about this week, but ordinarily, America has a huge reputation in Italy as the sort of country that solves problems. And so they saw me in a certain way, I think, as their problem solver. I would get them the attention in America. They would get the funding. The Oprah would raise millions for them. If you ask why that didn't happen, I mean, there's some details, but I think fundamentally, and it's an interesting story, I think, about the dynamics of a family with an illness. Half of the people in the family did not have the mutation, right? So you have a natural split within the family about who is 100% committed to whatever it takes to get a cure and who would just like to pretend this isn't happening. I just think that's an incredibly strong force. With the slide I showed you of the two American graduate researchers, it just, let's see if I can find that again. I mean, Eric and Sonia just didn't have that bifurcation. For them, it was entirely a thing about them. I mean, they were already, I mean, they weren't, I mean, it's a weirder story than you think. To become a prion researcher, I mean, is way hard. I mean, it's proteins. I mean, protein study is incredibly complicated and incredibly expensive to do. It's not like you have a bacterial infection, you want to learn about bacteria. I mean, there's only the best funded places do it, and the people who do it are highly trained. So for them to walk in and say, I actually have this condition, and I'd really like to apprentice you, was an stunningly difficult thing to do. And that they've succeeded in their research is even more amazing. I'm not saying they'll solve the disease, but it's an interesting sort of second route. In the Italian family, you have, I would argue, something that seemed very, very forward-thinking at the time and took a lot of courage, which was to acknowledge that they had it, right? I mean, they had never acknowledged it before. They lived in a small village, and the idea that half of them, would have this disease made them, obviously it's a problem when you're trying to find a spouse. I mean, and it would have been a known problem, and the less it was talked about, and it wasn't talked about at all, the better for them. Whereas, Eric and Sonia live in a whole different world. They're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They were already together. And so I just think, I don't want to pat the Americans on the back and say, look how much braver they were, because I don't really think that's what's operative here. But I am in awe of their ability to simply drop their lives and retrain. I mean, most of us, when we have a terrible disease, we look to experts to save us, right? But they want to become the experts who save her. So do we have any natural questions, as they say in medicine, as opposed to iatrogenic questions? Anyone? We might have to call on you for a second one, Pam.
I mean, I don't know
All
the
right.
difference between those two types
The people
of
who sit in the
questions.
front. Some patterns never change in school.
This will be simple, I think, is how many cases or how many people have been identified with having this? And
Okay, so the question is how many people, how many cases? You know, there are about 50 families in the world. I don't know enough genetics to know why there aren't more, because it's an absolutely simple point mutation. I mean, there is no simpler genetic flaw than they have, and that's one reason I think it's the kind of thing that you know, CRISPR would be a terrific candidate for, except there aren't enough patients. So you've got 50 in families. Then you're always going to get the sporadic cases, which is, I believe, 1 in a million. You know, so rare, rare, rare. I mean, if you're an ordinary physician, you're never going to see any of these cases. Again, if you're at a teaching hospital, you would at some point say, oh, there's a Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, you know, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease patient. You know, oh, really? That's amazing. Or there's a related condition called Gersman-Straussler-Schenkler, I think, or Schenkler-Straussman, that also comes up. And they're all actually mutations of the same gene. Then you would have how many people are infected by it, right? So, I mean, that's the great question, really. And that comes back to mad cow disease. So, and also to the definition of infection. Because so the thing about these prions, right, is they can take as long as 20 years, 30 years to develop into disease. And that's why Carlton Gajdusek, Nobel Prize winner #1, called them slow viruses. What's interesting about mad cow disease is that those people died very quickly. And except for the fact that the protein was similar in structure, because, you know, it was cow to cow, but it was cow to human shouldn't have been that efficient. So there was a calculation about how many doses had been delivered. It's in the book, but I think it's like 800 billion doses. And there was another study that found an enormous percentage of people in England showed some sign of prion, I don't know if the word would be infection, but possibly infection in their brain tissue. But I don't believe anyone dies of it currently. I mean, it would be in the newspapers in England because they're still aware of it. I think until very, very recently, or maybe even to the present day, you could not give blood in America if you had lived in England during the mad cow period. I mean, I know that was true, like 5 years ago. I don't know, is that still true? Does anyone? They may have finally dropped it. But the point is, like, these diseases go on and on. But I guess the best answer right now is that nobody may be infected with it. There are a couple of interesting fringe studies that came up when I was doing the research on this, and I think they're useful if you're going to do research. There was one study, for instance, by a Yale neurologist that looked at Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, in some ways, has some similar kind of pathological signs, especially sort of tangled fibrils. This researcher found, I'll make the number up slightly, that 40% of all people who died of Alzheimer's actually had prion disease too. And of course, you know, at the time that set off, I mean, I don't even know what it would do today, but at the time it set off a huge conspiracy theory. But nobody ever replicated the findings, and they've kind of been disregarded. But there would still be some people out there who think that actually much of Alzheimer's is a result of mad cow infection. I mean, I don't think any serious scientists would see it because it was never replicated. But it's, you know, something to think about.
Anyone?
Hi, my name's Alex, and wonderful talk and lecture. Really fascinating. I don't know if you know or be aware, but is this related at all to normal insomnia or completely something else?
So it's called fatal familial insomnia. So I get 1 or 2 emails a month now. It used to be a week. From people saying, I haven't slept for, 3 weeks or 6 months. I think I probably have fatal insomnia. And for a while, I would write them back and say, if you really had fatal insomnia for 6 months, you wouldn't be able to write this email. But now I just urge everybody to see a neurologist, because I feel like that will get them into the medical system. And if they think they have this condition, they probably might have other things that bear looking at. I mean, the short answer is no. Like, this is not insomnia is the most salient symptom. And it certainly accelerates their deaths, we still don't really know what sleep does. It's one of the great sort of strange, it's not the absolute black hole it once was, but it's still, considering that we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, there's remarkably little known about it. Part of what I write about in the book is theories about sleep and tests that have been done, or various efforts that have been made to figure out why you can't live without sleep, or why you always fall back asleep. You enter a period where you're no longer able to stay awake. And the fact is that the thing that sticks in my mind is a researcher named, I think it was Alan Reckstaffen, who said that if sleep doesn't play some absolutely vital principle in biology, it's the greatest mistake nature ever made. Because from a Darwinian point of view and an evolutionary point of view, you're exposing yourself for 8 hours, 1/3 of your life, completely unprotected. So what is sleep doing for us? And there are lots of kind of answers. I mean, I think we all know intuitively that in some way it must serve to refresh the body, but that's not really a technical answer. There are ideas that it helps to sort of refresh the memory circuits. These ideas, I think, kind of come and go. One of the problems with researching sleep is there's really no money to research sleep. So there's a ton of money for sleep apnea because you can cure it, and an insurance company will pay for it. There's very little money for pure sleep research. So I would say, I mean, if you are having trouble sleeping, you don't have fatal insomnia. You don't even have, let's imagine a disease called transient fatal insomnia. So that doesn't make much sense, but you get what I mean. Like you could have a million other things. You could be anxious. You could have more biological causes. You could have sleep apnea. But this is an extraordinary rare disease. It basically begins with an injury to the thalamus. I mean, when you have insomnia on an ordinary basis, your thalamus is no more affected, than your feet. I mean, that's just not what's going on. So in effect, insomnia is kind of one of the downstream results of an absolutely devastating blow to your head to your thalamus that would probably honestly kill you anyway, because you can't regulate your body temperature. It's progressive, right? So the cool thing, or the terrible thing, depending on where you sit about our friend the prion, is that it's not just one prion touches another prion and turns it into a malicious, curvy beast. That one in turn touches the next prion and turns that and so you get a forward reaction until your brain is going to be full of misformed prions. So what happens, for instance, in the family, is for a period of time when they're younger, probably they're forming a certain number of malformed prions, but they're not in turn creating other malformed prions. They're probably being, they're defective proteins. They're probably chopped up and ushered out of the cell successfully. Then as you get older, everything works less well, and so you're beginning to get an aggregation. And then the aggregation moves forward. And that's why I believe that's the best theory on why this is a disease that gets to you in your 50s, say, and not your 20s, although there were examples of really young people who had it. I mean, there's always some diversity in these sort of genetic diseases.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Sure.
I was just curious, I'm thinking of the woman who has this disease and now is becoming a prion researcher.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that I think about a little bit as a medical student, what it does to you to research something that you personally have, or maybe someone who personally has a disease, especially if that disease doesn't currently have really good outcomes or good research on it, and especially if your own research ends up being futile, what are your thoughts on that? I guess it's not really a question.
No, I mean, it's a good question, because to the extent we're thinking about this as a cultural history, which I'm not a doctor. I am fascinated by the medicine of prion diseases, but I'm also fascinated by things like why Carlton Gajdusek, Nobel 1976, couldn't see, he actually had the whole might of the NIH behind him, and they paid for everything. He was a guy who never had to worry about raising money in his life. And he has all these resources, and he can't see what's in front of his eyes to see, right? Why was it an anthropologist? I don't want to overdo the gender card, but it was actually a woman anthropologist who's still living. and when Carlton died, which was maybe about 10 years ago, all of the obits said Carlton died, she discovered the cause of Kuru, and it's not true. I mean, she still couldn't even get credit, even though it was established in the professional literature that she had solved it. So I'm very interested in the cultural side. I think when I first met Sonia, let me see if I can get them back up. I know they're way at the end. I first met Sonia when she had just been diagnosed, and it was actually her husband who wrote me, or I think they were maybe just partners then, and they're married now. And it was very hard for me to think about anything but just how terrifying this must be for her. But she was already a professional. I think she was a lawyer, if I remember right, or maybe that was him. But I mean, they had a professional side to them, and she had already, I think, begun to think about it as a not as just this like Baroque awful fate, because I mean, she'd been there for her mother, so she did know what it was like, and she was certainly devastated. But to think about it as a problem that could be cracked. And again, I don't know if the fact that they both had master's degrees, so they had already done that kind of work, helped them to sort of keep the terror away. I mean, you do see certain patterns. I mean, I do think it's interesting, although not surprising, for instance, in the Italian family, that Ignazia wasn't actually a genetic member of the family, right? And that may have made it possible for the family to look to an expert. Like they looked like, oh, he's not us, he's a doctor, but he's a member of the family, so a kind of a perfect overlap for them. And I think maybe in America, I don't know Sonia and Erica that well, but I do remember for me, maybe because it's just me, like what amazed me was just that they'd actually like left their day jobs, and then the rejection, the difficulty. I mean, going in and saying you want to research proteins. I mean, it's almost like walking into a rocket, a place that's manufacturing rockets and saying like, I really want to work on one of these. I mean, it's just like, or not even a rocket, but the electronics and the computer code of a rocket. It's really hard, and that amazed me incredibly that they would, that they would tear up their lives, which already, in a sense, had this shock, right? And for them, a big question was children, right? I mean, I think that was probably, I can't remember the exact conversations, but I'm almost sure. And by the way, if you want to, if you go to the New Yorker, type in my name and Prion's A Love Story, you can see the original piece. It's just one page. It's not a whole article where I talk to them. And there have been other articles about them since, so they're actually, well followed. But to tear up your life in that way so that you don't even have your day job, and she was young. I mean, she was maybe 25, so this is a disease that strikes you at 50, so you're talking about 25 years, right? So they had decided that they would, and they were educated. They knew, at that point I remember there's a thing Prusner once said, second Nobel Prize, the guy who did this super tedious work of purifying until he basically proved prions had to be the disease causer. And he was at a meeting in Germany, I think in 1993, and Mad Cow had already, 2003, and Mad Cow had already kind of fallen off of the radar, and he was at a meeting of prion researchers, and he turned to the audience and he said, "This is the largest gathering of prion researchers there will ever be." As he knew the funding would dry up, people would go on to the next disease. So Sonia and Eric knew that that this was not, that this was not an area that was going to give them easy solutions. I mean, I don't think, they weren't under the impression this was like, finding something simple. And they would have understood the genetics as well. So, I mean, that's what struck me, was that they were willing to, they were just going to, when there are all these studies in psychology about, what you would do today to avoid something 25 years from now, or what you would avoid today to do something, like immediate gratification. This is the reverse, right? And I just was amazed that they could, that they could focus that way, and not just one individual, but a couple, right? I mean, couples have differing needs, but they both went into prion research. I mean, they made it a thing that they did, and they put out yearly reports, and they've identified, I mean, it's such slow work. I mean, honestly, like they may have, identified candidate drugs. At one point, they took like all the sort of approved drugs and just threw them at prion disease, and they went through that stage and so on. But there is no, I mean, as far as I know, for the genetic version, I think we're going to have embryo selection without a doubt. That's going to be, I mean, it's already available. For the sporadic thing, there's really no answer, right? I mean, but it's so rare, we're never going to have funding on it. I think the infectious thing is the most interesting question, because I mean, there's really no reason why, who's going to remember mad cow disease if there's another outbreak and nobody can identify it? I mean, just look at our response to COVID and the confusion and the societal stress. So that's actually, to me, the most unknowable thing is what would the future hold in terms of a possible prion outbreak. I mean, we really don't know why, everyone in the sort of, in the world of sort of veterinary medicine sort of is pleased that we didn't have massive, an epidemic basically of people dying from mad cow disease, but nobody really understands the mechanics or the mechanism by which it didn't happen. I mean, enough exposure. In England, there was certainly enough exposure. And also possibly on the continent. And in the US, we were really just lucky. We just didn't do, I mean, the US is a place where usually, if you can find a cheaper way to feed a cow, you will, but for whatever reason, this wasn't the solution here. I don't think there were regulations. I just think maybe it was the cost of other feeds was just lower. So it was cheaper than getting rendered cattle protein.
Thank you so much for this talk, and Daniel will be available to sign books out in the lobby area if you're interested, and thanks again.
Thank you all. I hope your burritos were delicious.